Hey everybody, coming to you from my classroom. Welcome. Um, I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about the chapter that I read, which was the legal and epistemological underpinnings of the construction of disability. Epistemological, hard word to pronounce and harder to understand for a moment, but I promise you this chapter is actually really interesting. It involves a lot of informational and cultural backgrounds, which the whole chapter is arguing, hey, look, there's the mainstream way of thinking and then there's the cultural way of thinking. And if our parents and people are coming from a different culture than what the American Western dream is, then having an IEP or having special education or having just rights in general are going to be different. Not only different, but like difficult to understand, especially if you're from a place where student rights, educational rights aren't like this big thing. So, as you're going through the PowerPoint, I just want you to look through your chapters as well. I labeled every slide for the different section it talked about. I tried to break down some of the vocab for it because I had a hard time understanding some of it. I don't think I've ever Googled so much just to make sure I understood what I was reading. But the main idea and the main things that I took away from it was that one, we put a lot of pressure for parents to understand like everything that's going on, what their rights are, what their student rights are, and like why it's important. But a lot of parents may come to us and not know like educational rights is a thing and that it's something that you need to care about. And here are all your rights, and this is why it's important. Because in their culture or their background, like it's not something that they look at. This chapter also looks at how disabilities have a cultural context. So, like in some cultures, depending on social views, one disability may seem worse than another. Like a person without an arm in one culture where canoeing is strong, would seem to it'd be worse to not have an arm than to say be unable to read, because having your arm means you can control a canoe, which is your basic way of survival. Um, I'm jumping around. One thing I also thought was interesting was like the comparison between the medical information, like the medical model, and the spiritual model, in contrasting cultural traditions. Uh, and what it just sounds like is like looking at like disability as a physical phenomenon, an individual phenomenon, a chronic illness, are requiring like remediation is like the clinical perspective. Like this is what it looks like in the West versus the spiritual side, which looks at it from a cultural perspective. So one example, like a comparison and contrast, is time. In the Western culture, time is like here, this is now. There's no past life, there's no future life. Like you just have to live it now. So if your Western views are we only have so much time, then you're going to think, okay, we need to figure out something for this disability, we need to seek help. Rather than if you're coming from a cultural background where it's non-Western and non-traditional, you're like, hey, time's infinite. We have past lives, we have future lives. This disability is just temporary. Sometimes it may be a punishment from the God. Sometimes it's like a reward. So it doesn't really like matter, because it's eventually going to be dealt with. Um, I just thought this chapter was interesting. It went back and forth from like how the IDEA was created, the type of movements that were there to create it. There's like 1,000 different examples from different cultures and abilities. I'm just like, tell me more. Anyway, the slides little long, little broken down, but there's about 19 or so. So pace yourself when you're reading it. The point is that each section is labeled so that when you see the questions at the end, you're like, okay, no, I remember this is where she talked about this at, so this is how I want to respond. The main thing I want you guys to take away from this is that, like, how some of these ideas, even though this was written back in the day, like, how a lot of this stuff is still apparent in education right now in your classroom. Like, how are these ideas still being used? I mean, how are they affecting our students and our family currently? Other than that, I hope you enjoy everything and have a wonderful day. Say bye to my classroom. Woo!